Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. The webinar topic for today is how to optimize your Magento site for a better user experience. And that's going to be presented by Macquarie Telecom's Mike Lynch, Magento engineer, and Stuart Mills, head of Webco, where they'll talk you through some best practice tips for optimizing for Magento. Today's webinar is being recorded, so if anyone has any problems accessing or wants to see it again, that will be sent out for everyone following up the webinar in the next few days. Further, any questions can be asked throughout the presentation simply by accessing the questions interface of your GoToWebinar control panel. Without anything more, I'm going to hand over to Mike, who will be able to begin the presentation, and I believe he'll also be introducing Stuart. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Campbell. Actually, it's Stuart Mills here. I'm going to open the webinar today. Hello, everyone. As Campbell said, I'm the head of what we call our digital and SaaS hosting business here. That's the part of Macquarie's business that looks after all of our online retailers and e-commerce customers. The topic today is hosted Magento optimization. Magento is becoming an increasingly popular CMS for online retailers in Australia. They have something like over 5,000 installations now and about 40% of the market share. And we're partnering with Magento to help them offer their customers an improved user experience on the software. And that's really what the world of e-commerce is all about today. If you're an e-commerce business owner, you kind of care about one thing to start with, which is how much revenue am I making? But when you look under the covers, there are a number of factors that affect that, and that's around certainly the user experience and in particular conversion rates to sales. If you dig a little bit deeper, why do people buy from your site apart from your content? One thing you must absolutely make sure is that you're offering the highest speed performance both during day-to-day sales levels, but in particular around peak demand periods such as Christmas or Valentine's Day. The question then arises, how do we make sure that we are absolutely offering that speed to our customers? And the answer isn't just around software, it isn't just around design, it is around the entire, what we call the stack. It's certainly how your Magento is configured, but it's also how your network's configured and your choice of cloud provider, making sure that they are optimizing the infrastructure upon which your Magento is installed. So I'd like to hand over now to Mike Lynch. Mike is our resident e-commerce optimization consultant, and we're going to share with you today our thoughts and our recommendations about how you, as business owners for Magento, can deliver an exceptional user experience using Magento. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stuart. Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks also to the guys from Power Retail, Campbell and Grant, for making today possible, and welcome to everyone out there. As Stuart said, my name's Mike Lynch. I'm the Macquarie Telecom Magento consultant and engineer. I've been in web development for about 12 or 13 years, and mainly in open source PHP and MySQL systems, a lot of open source CMS systems. I've spent about 5 years with Magento Community and Enterprise, and also spent a fair bit of time in the SEO and SEM industry as a solution architect and digital producer. So yeah, I understand the importance of the user interface and user experience for customers. At Macquarie, I work with the sales team, with technical consultants and engineers to provide solutions for customers. So we've built and managed several benchmarking tools in-house that can run your site through the paces and give you a really nice report on how your site actually performs. So I'll go through a little bit more of that later. Yeah, moving on, we're looking at why we would optimize our Magento platform stack, which is what I will get to now. Oh, sorry, we're just having a bit of slide difficulty. So the user experience factor, we all know that better site performance means faster page load times, and faster page load times mean a better user experience. A better user experience means a higher conversion rate for business owners. So In a recent study by Akamai and Radware, they've come up with some statistics on this, where they said that 73% of mobile internet users interviewed said they've encountered a website that was too slow. 51% of mobile internet users say they've encountered a website that crashed, froze, or received an error while they were using it. 38% of these users said that they encountered a website that wasn't even available, and 40% of interviewed customers said that they expect a site to load in 2 seconds or less, a single page. So 40% of people are abandoning a website that takes more than 3 seconds to load, and a 1 second delay in page response can result in a 7% reduction in conversions for business owners. So this affects your bottom line, in quite obvious ways. If your site's turning over 100 grand a day, a 1 second page delay above that 2 second load time can cost you $2.5 million in sales every year. So it's a pretty big deal. So getting onto the Magento platform, you can see here in this very simple diagram that the Magento platform is made up of several stacks that sit on top of hardware and software. So we start with the hardware infrastructure and architecture, which is your networking, so everything from the internet coming into your firewalls, your connections between your servers in the data center, everything there. The security factor, so that's your SSL certificates and your actual firewalls, and then your actual servers, whether they're physical or virtual boxes sitting inside a data center. On top of that, you've got your operating system. So in Magento's case, it's always Linux. You probably wouldn't run it on iOS. And then your application servers sitting on top. So that's your web servers, your Apache or your Nginx, your database servers, your MySQL, and then your different caching systems and enterprise search if you don't use Magento's built-in search. Then on top of that, at the very bottom of the stack, you've got the Magento application code. So that's all of your PHP and Magento app files. So you can see there that before you even get to the Magento code optimization, you've got an awful lot of stack there that can be optimized and tuned to go a little bit faster. So what does all of this involve? The first part is the hardware architecture. So asking how your server resources are allocated, whether your database server is separate to your web server, whether your Magento admin panel is chewing up resources when you guys are uploading images and products to it that should be really being reserved for your customers at the front end, whether your site search is slowing down the system, which is quite common. It's quite a heavy PHP process and a query against the database, so that can really slow the system down. Whether or not your system uses the right amount of RAM for the database, which is quite a memory-intensive operation, and if your system uses the right amount of CPU for the web server, which is all PHP in Magento's case. So all of these things can be divided up, and whether you're using the right type of storage for your various resources is another question you need to ask. So, whether you're storing things in RAM, whether you're storing things on SAS drives, SSD drives, everything like that. So you can see here in our the way we've divided up the stack, your front-end cache might be, say, Varnish in front of Magento or the Magento full-page cache, and that would ideally be RAM-allocated storage for the best speed, but otherwise a fast storage medium would be good. Your web server, you can see our little push-me-pull-you there can be divided up into your front-end web server and your back-end web server. So your Magento admin interface can run on a separate web server very easily in configuration, and you'll find if you have a look at any of your monitoring tools, you probably take about 2/3 of your resources out by moving that onto a separate server, so your customers get a much better experience. That's very CPU intensive because it's running all of the PHP computation and things like that. Next down in the stack, you've got your database server, and once again, note the plural there. So you can have a read database and a write database. Magento allows you to split that configuration, and you can divide that up. So put your fast storage in the right places that you want to be using it, and for the places where you're using it most, obviously your read is probably the place that's getting used most in a Magento installation. So that's a fairly RAM-intensive operation, but it also likes to have very fast storage mediums underneath it to retrieve files and things off the database. At the bottom end of this stack, we've got the database cache, and once again, there's a plural there. You can have a fast cache and a slow cache with Magento for storing your customer sessions and retrieving database records. So that's a very RAM-intensive operation as well, and much like the MySQL database, it really likes fast storage. So moving on from there, we'll look at the actual database optimization of your site. So MySQL is what really runs Magento by default. It's, as we've said, it really likes RAM, so you can see our little RAMy picture there. It likes to use as much of that as possible. You can allocate the entire MySQL database into memory allocated storage, which is the fastest performance that I've seen before. It needs to be tuned a little bit, but you can definitely do this quite easily. And if you're not using RAM allocated storage, it still uses a lot of memory to run the MySQL processes. So the next step down the stack is whether you're using a standard fork of the MySQL code. So you can see here on the left we've got the MySQL logo and a fork, and that is the default build of MySQL that's available in open source. There are some other forks which have been taken over by separate companies, so MariaDB or Pacona Server. I would recommend dropping these in as direct replacements for MySQL. They'll be perfectly compatible with your database, but you'll get a definite performance increase by applying those. Pacona also have a really nice little configuration wizard on their website, which will get you started on your MySQL configuration file, and it's quite straightforward. You wouldn't just use the default that comes out of the wizard, but it's a really good way to get you started, where you basically punch in your server memory, whether your server's doing other jobs apart from database and things like that, and it spits you out a configuration file. So that can be found on the Pacona website, and we can send you links. The next stage of database option is deciding whether you're using more read queries or more write queries. Now, in an e-commerce website, the write queries are basically happening when a customer puts something in their cart, when they create a username and password, and when you're actually adding products to the cart in the Magento backend. So that being said, you would hope that you're getting more customers looking at the front end of your website and browsing than you are adding products in the back end. So you always want to be stacking up your Magento stack for more read queries than write queries. And this definitely comes into play, particularly when you split your database out into a read server and a slaved write server. The next section down is where are your slow queries originating and how do you track them down? MySQL, particularly under Magento, is notorious for having an awful lot of very slow queries. You can configure MySQL to actually write a log file for when a query is above a certain time or threshold, and that's easily set up with your logs there. Also, active monitoring of these situations. I really like New Relic monitoring, which I'm sure a lot of you out there are using to monitor slow SQL queries. It gives you really simple graphs, and it's mobile compatible and things like that, and it makes it really easy to track down where those are happening and what PHP page they're coming from. So sometimes it might be an extension you've installed on Magento or some custom code, and that's a really easy way to know where to change your code. So yeah, talk to your developers about that. And last but not least, whether you're storing your Magento session and cache in database or in hard disk, or by default Magento stores it in the file system under Magento, I would highly recommend installing Redis, which is an open source key-based data store, and storing your user sessions in that. You'll get much faster performance out of it. This can be run on the same data server as the database, but I'd recommend probably putting it on a separate box if possible, because then you can allocate resources just to that. So that is the database optimization piece, and then we move over to the actual web server optimization. So this is like things like deciding whether you're running Apache or Nginx. Apache is by far the most common web server on the internet, as I'm sure you're all aware, but Nginx is definitely catching up. It runs systems like Facebook and Netflix, and really high data powers. It's got some reverse proxying abilities in it, so when your site gets to a really large amount of concurrent sessions, you'll actually find running Nginx and PHP FPM you'll be able to alleviate a fair bit of CPU there. So that's definitely something to look at. The version of PHP that you're running, and whether your web server is correctly set up to handle multiple threads. So I'll just come over here to this diagram where you can see the split. The multi-threaded config, almost everybody uses more than one CPU core on their server these days, so your web server should be configured to do that by default. It should handle individual processes under each different server thread, and only limit those to where you want them. There are also some really good sort of emergency failovers where you can automatically restart your web server if it blows through its its ceiling of multi-threaded processes. Underneath that, I'd talk about Apache, particularly Apache modules. Nginx is pretty stable on its modules, but there's a lot of Apache modules that aren't there by default, such as deflate or the zip module and the rewrite module, which is in there by default, but not generally switched on for Magento. I'd also talk about removing. Apache comes with probably 20 modules that can just be removed easily, and this will let you lighten the load on your server a little bit. So removing the auto index and the auth modules. There's a few others in there that we can give you more information on, but that'll definitely lighten the load on your Apache configuration quite a little bit. So moving on from web server optimization, our next section is caching. This is probably the easiest and most important part of Magento performance enhancement. So if you're using Magento Enterprise, you've got the full page cache module, available, and it's very good. Particularly in the most recent version of Magento Enterprise, it does a really good job. But can probably be run a little bit faster if you use something else, which I'll talk about shortly. The bytecode caching for PHP, prior to version 5.5 and 5.4, you're most likely using APC here, which is a freely available PHP module. I've had some really good performance enhancements just by using Opcache, one of the newer Zend-based bytecode caching systems. So you'll find now that Magento supports PHP version 5.4, it's definitely worth talking to your devs about getting that opcode cache in there in place of APC, because you'll see an immediate performance improvement, which I will demonstrate to you in a second. And the last section on what you'd like to install is whether you're using varnish caching. So to demonstrate how this caching system works, this is a simple vanilla test we've done against a Magento installation. This is on a server with 2 gigs of RAM and 2 CPUs, so it's a very light server. Installed Magento out of the box on MySQL. It's running PHP 5.5, and we've hit the server with 50 users for 15 seconds, which is not a great real-world test, but this will just give you an idea of how terribly Magento performs out of the box. So you can see that the response time of the server before it's even ready to serve pages was on average for those 50 users nearly 7 seconds for the home page, and more than 7 seconds for a product page. So a customer's waiting 7 seconds after they hit your server before it's even ready to display a page. So this is not great in terms of that 3-second or 2-second page load time that you're after. The longest transactions there in this graph shows that it's between 11 and 16 seconds for the home page and the product page. So once again, a customer's waiting 15 seconds for a page to load when they're looking at a product. And on a mobile phone, or when people are looking at things all day in their lunch hour, this is really just unacceptable. And you can see the shortest transaction there is still 2 seconds nearly, and that's the absolute shortest out of those 50 users that were hitting it. So not ideal. Down the bottom there, you can see the separate graph, which is really important, the transactions per second. So this is how many transactions per second the server is able to handle under load. And you can see by default, and this is being tested from the local machine, I should stress as well, that the Magento homepage was able to serve 6 pages per second to customers and 1 product page per second to customers, which is, if you're getting a few hundred customers hitting your website at the same time, your server is basically going to explode because its CPU is going to be hating you. So in our next graph, you can see after installing PHP 5 Opcache, which I was just talking about earlier, the bytecode, we've just halved our response time on the server, so we've gotten down to 3 seconds wait instead of 7, and 5.6 for the product page. So that's already made a huge performance increase, as has the longest transaction and shortest transaction time, where we're well below 2 seconds for the shortest transaction time. It's still not a great result on the product page for the longest transaction. And you can see down the bottom the transactions per second. We've actually more than doubled our homepage test, and we've quadrupled our product page test. So by simply installing this PHP Opcache module under PHP and enabling it, you're going to get almost a double increase in performance for your web server straight away. And these are for static pages. These aren't for when a customer's signing up or adding something to the checkout. But 90% of your Google Analytics is going to show you that most people are browsing your site before they buy something. So they, you want to be serving these pages as quickly as possible. Now, next up is the really interesting graph. This is after we install Varnish 3 on the exact same server. So remember, we've still got 2 gigs of RAM and 2 CPUs here. And you can see our response time has gone down to 10 milliseconds from 7 seconds in the first homepage test. our longest transaction is at 1/4 of a second for the homepage, and our shortest transactions weren't even measurable in these tests. They were so fast that the benchmarking system couldn't even make a number that small. So this is, pretty good value for static pages on your site. The really interesting graph, once again, is down the bottom. So instead of being able to serve 6 transactions per second and 1 transaction per second on the homepage and product page, we're now serving 6,000 plus, and that means that effectively 50 users hitting your site are going to be able to see a hell of a lot more pages per second, and this scales exponentially. So if you've got 100 people sitting on your site for 10 minutes each, they're going to be able to just view pages like lightning. And I think particularly in terms of mobile data, this sort of statistic's really important these days. So that is our graph. You can see the scales have changed a little bit on the left-hand sides of those graphs, but yeah, if you can, get Varnish Cache installed in front of Magento. It even works nicely alongside the Magento full page cache for our enterprise users out there. So once again, caching your database queries and user sessions, I know I've already told you this stuff, but caching those in Redis is going to give you a much faster transaction rate than simply storing them in MySQL or in the file system. And where you're storing those, once again, whether you're putting them on disk or if they're coming out of memory, I wouldn't recommend storing them on Apple II drives, but if you do have them handy, it's always worth a crack. So moving along from the caching piece, I won't talk too much about this, but the simple configuration in the back end of Magento will definitely get you a performance boost. The first one is finding out what third-party extensions you're using and switching off the ones that you don't need. A lot of Magento sites are a few years old, even through a couple of upgrades. You might have third-party extensions in there that you don't even know why they're there, or they've been superseded by much better versions. So testing your site before you've switched them off and after you switch them off, you'll most likely see a massive improvement in those. In the Magento system configuration, which you guys should be able to do yourselves if you have permissions, you can just go in and switch on the flat catalog format under your catalog settings, and that basically reads, for a product, it reads one line of data out of the database rather than several tables. So you get a much faster product retrieval rate there, especially with sites that have more than 1,000 products in them. The system logs by default store in Magento for 180 days, which you just don't need, and it takes up an enormous amount of database space. So, by switching this down to, say, 3 days and having it auto-purge itself, I've seen Magento databases go from 10 or 12 gigabytes down to less than a gigabyte, even with more than 1,000 products in them. So really recommend switching that one on. And then finally, just compressing and minifying your JavaScript and CSS files. You can do this in the back-end system. Once again, you get an enormous performance increase on the front end for that. And I can't believe how many sites out there actually don't do this. So people are reading a full-size JavaScript file or a full-size CSS file with all comments and everything in it, when they really only need to be viewing the minified version. So that, in a nutshell, is how we would go about doing our Magento platform optimization, and then we'd hand over to your developers where you can optimize your code, you can update your themes, you can put in maybe some new extensions and things which will help you there. So the way that we test all of that stuff is what we like to call our benchmarking, as you can see there with our muscle man lifting his weights. The point of benchmarking is being able to actually quantitatively test your server. So how many users can hit my pages, how many users can add products to my cart, what this means to my front-end customers. A lot of people don't know how their Magento site performs, so it's a really worthwhile service. And we can offer this for you if you get in touch with us after the seminar to let you know how we can do it and what specific benchmarks would be best for your system. We have a couple of light versions, and then we have a much more in-depth version which we can throw at your server. So the first stage of that is static page testing, which is give you results much like the graphs we saw before, how many transactions per second a static page can give you, how many users can hit it before your server starts blowing itself. Dynamic page testing, so this is actually adding things to cart, creating a wish list, customers signing up, how many users you can handle at once on your server. We do the checkout speed testing, so from woe to go, adding a product to your cart and getting all the way through to payment, how long that takes for a customer to happen. We try to throw as many customers simultaneously at the server as possible, so we get a proper reading, and we usually do these tests several times over. And then user account testing, so a customer logging in, being able to see old transactions, being able to see their old orders and things like that is really important. So the speed of that experience for your existing customers is really important. From there, we give you a full report on all the benchmarks, obviously, and we make point-by-point optimization recommendations. So suppose your cart's really fast, but your static pages are really slow, we're going to give you a different set of recommendations to what we have if your static pages are really fast and your cart's really slow. So, we can help you reallocate your server resources there and what needs to be installed in the stack or configured. It's always important to retest the performance. So after you've optimized, you should know how much your numbers have improved, and we can give you a full report on that as well. And you should effectively be able to bring this down to a number on revenue, which you'll see in your Google Analytics and your goal conversions, where you'll know exactly how customers are responding to this stuff. You should see a drastic increase in conversions and ROI. So that is our performance benchmarking in a nutshell. Please get in touch with us. If you'd like to know more about it, or you'd like a free quick benchmark test, we can provide those for you for sure. Now, next up, what all of this basically means is what you want to look for in a cloud hosting provider. So when you're out there looking for your Magento hosting, you can go with VPSs, you can go with other solutions, dedicated servers, but these days I think cloud is definitely the way to go. Nearly everybody's moving there now, so you're sort of missing out a little bit if you don't. So the first thing to look for is the location. So a lot of providers only have servers in farms overseas, or away from your customers. Essentially, you want your location to be as close to your customers as possible. So when they're retrieving files, when they're doing a DNS lookup, they're hitting your servers where you want them to be. If most of your customers are in Australia, host in Australia. If most of your customers are in India, host in India. The other important part of that, obviously, is the data sovereignty piece. So if people want to know that their data is hosted in Australia and owned by an Australian company and all of that sort of thing, but you can probably read more about that, in various places, so I won't harp on about it too much. So the performance of the networking of the cloud that you're hosting in, so that's everything from the internet connection, as I said before, but also inside the data center. If you have a database server and a web server, the speed that they talk to each other at is really important. So making sure that you can measure that, or you can be provided with statistics on that from your cloud provider, that's of vital importance, I think. The compute performance, so this is your actual CPU load testing. You should be able to know what clock speeds and things your CPUs are running at on your cloud servers, but also the allocation of those resources. People do an awful lot of what they call oversubscribing, where multiple people hosting websites are being shared amongst one CPU or two CPUs. So if you can, it's vital to get a private cloud where you own the resources and you don't have any oversubscription unless you want to, and that you're able to slice up that compute and share that amongst your servers yourself. So put a lot of CPU on your PHP servers, but not too much on your database servers and so forth. This goes double for the RAM. So you want to make sure that you're not oversubscribed, you're not sharing your memory with any other customers, and that you're able to allocate more RAM to your database server and less to your PHP web server. So that should be configurable in any cloud provider, and you should definitely have words if it's not. The last piece in the cloud hosting is the storage performance. So as I said earlier, a lot of people are going crazy for SSD drives and things like that, which is really good. They do some things really well, but in some of our benchmark testing, we've found that hybrid drives, and particularly drives with good on-disk caching, are getting much better read performance than SSD drives. So you might want to divide things up a little bit between your write server and your read server, as I said earlier, and possibly choose SSD or a similar technology for your writing, but I would be having a look at some other technologies such as hybrid systems for the actual reading of that data, because you can be much faster, as we'll see later on. So that is the end of my section of the presentation. I'd like to hand you it back over to Stuart now, who can talk to you a little bit about a recent benchmarking test that we've had done by an American company called the Tolly Group.
Thanks, Mike, for your words of wisdom. Plenty to think about there in terms of the software layer and configuration of the software, but what I want to do now is kind of join the dots. You could spend a lot of time pretty much going through everything Mike suggested you do, and then at the last hurdle fall over. And that hurdle is the cloud. Now, not all clouds are designed equal, we know that. In particular, what I'll show called the large public clouds, they're more about cramming as many customers on for the lowest possible cost to them as possible, not worrying about the performance of your business to your users. So we kind of went out and said, well, how do we really make sure that we're delivering on our brand promise around high performance hosting? So we got an independent company called Tolly to look at some clouds, including our own. These guys are a technology benchmarking business, and they ran a series of tests on our cloud and some others to measure those critical performance characteristics that Mike has just spoken about. And I'll just show you some of those results now. So if we look at what we call LAN performance, so LAN performance is pretty much how fast one server can talk to another, so how fast your website server can talk to the database server and get content from that. You can see there's a big difference there. The big public clouds are not putting an emphasis on this. They're cramming a lot of compute into one area, and their networks are over congested, so that slows down your website. Macquarie's performing rather well there. Next one we're going to look at is a postmark test. For those of you who don't know what that is, this is pretty much a load test of transactions on the website. So in this test, there was 25,000 transactions run, asking for 500 files simultaneously. So much like the workload of a busy e-commerce site, maybe during peak periods. And you can see once again big difference between the public clouds and the private cloud architecture that Macquarie uses. The impact of that is you would need, for example, less web servers to service the same number of customers on the launch environment, or those customers would get a faster response time, and we know response time equals conversions. If you look at stream memory, so this is when Mike was talking about keeping your highest access content in RAM as opposed to disk. How quickly can we get that content out of RAM? And you can see a big difference there as well. And finally on the disk, so this is random read tests. How quickly can I get the content off the disk? So this could be pictures of my products or customer details. If that's slow, it's just another thing in the chain that will slow down the user experience. A big difference there as well. So you might say, well, so what? So the so what is, I mean, we all as e-commerce owners want to spend as little as we possibly can on hosting of our websites. So if we choose a cloud that's slow, we're probably going to have to buy more machines or faster bandwidth or more storage to kind of counteract that, and that actually will end up costing you more money than you thought. So our recommendations are aim for a cloud that is designed for high performance, and it will still cost you only what you expect to pay. And that's kind of our promise to the market in Australia. Well, thank you, everyone. That brings us to the end of our presentation today. I hope you enjoyed it. Both Mike and myself will be here now to answer questions, and I'll hand back to Campbell.
Well, thanks very much for that, Stuart, and that was a very in-depth, if a little bit fast presentation. I suppose we only have an hour to get through quite a lot of details there, but as we expected, everyone's quite interested in what you've had to say, and that's evidenced by the questions we've had come through. So I might just tackle those in order. Mike and Stuart, I'm not sure who's best to answer each one. I'll let you decide that as we go. But very early on, Tristan asked about running Magento on IIS. You mentioned that might not be a good idea, Mike. Why is that, and what should they do?
No worries. Thanks, Tristan. The problem with IIS is it's not natively built to run PHP. So if you're running a .NET site, obviously, choose a Microsoft platform. Magento's all been built with the open source language PHP in mind and MySQL databases in mind. I have seen it run on IIS, and through a couple of extra layers, you can get it to talk to a MySQL database running on a Windows server. But because it's really built to run on the open source stack, my recommendation would be using anything from Red Hat to Ubuntu to CentOS instead.
Fantastic. I'll remind everyone that you are welcome to post through questions. If we don't get to your question through the end of this period, we will hand them over to the presenters to be followed up afterwards. Wes asked early on about benchmarking. You had some benchmark slides up, Mike. Were they purely using Varnish, or was front page caching also on? Is there a benefit to be using front page caching and Varnish at the same time?
Oh yeah, sorry, I should have outlined that. Yeah, front page caching was on. That was on a Magento 1.8.1 community build, just with the default front page cache switched on in that. So it's not a full page cache, as people that would know, and it stores in the disk file system. So I was running that with Varnish on top of it, and using a custom module to purge the Varnish cache.
Fantastic. Mike then followed up with another question. He was asking about Magento's compilation feature. Can you explain a little bit more about compilation, and does it provide any benefit to current Magento versions?
No problems. In earlier versions of Magento, I think there was definitely a benefit to compilation. It was always really tricky to get it to work with particularly third-party extensions and some theme modifications. So in recent versions, they've sort of dropped off a little bit the emphasis on that. It can still be used to compress some of your files and things, but I think there are better third-party tools out there for doing that sort of thing. And as I mentioned, the minification or compression of JavaScript and CSS files was where the real benefit of that was coming from. And then using the PHP opt cache or APC will actually probably get you a better performance indicator than compilation. Plus, you've also got the added option, well, added bonus, I should say, in compilation, where you have to recompile Magento several times if you're going to be doing any code updates. So this can be a bit of an extra leg in your production workflow. So in recent versions, anything above Community 1.7 or Enterprise 1.1, I'd say you can probably leave compilation alone in terms of performance.
In a rejoinder to that, again from Wes has just come through then, he's asking, are there any specific websites, e-commerce websites, that you would point to as really good examples of someone who's done best practice in optimizing for speed and performance?
Yeah, no worries. I mean, someone that we host, I'd have a look at the Kathmandu site. They've got it running pretty nicely there. Some of the recent builds I've seen, Shorty's Liquor is a recent one that's actually quite nice. I won't mention the developer's name, but I'm sure you guys can find it. And yeah, there's the best way to find them is probably in some of the Magento discussion forums recently. But you know, people add to the showcase all the time. There's obviously a few overseas sites that run really nicely. For a community a community build in Australia that's been quite nicely put together, I'd probably have a look at DC Shoes. So they've done a pretty good job of you know, getting that thing to really hum. So yeah, those are probably the three I'd recommend off the top of my head.
Fantastic. Russell earlier asked a question about the ideal server and what that would consist of to run Magento. Is there an ideal? Is that such a thing, or will it depend on the retailer themselves, the business themselves?
Yeah, that's where I think the benchmarking really comes in handy. Literally, if you're getting 50 users a day hit your website and you're hosting 100 products, you know, you can probably get away with a much smaller build. It's knowing sort of how much traffic you get and how much traffic you expect, particularly as Stuart said, around those Christmas time or Valentine's Day or God forbid Click Frenzy sales. You know, you really want to be able to throw as much at your server as possible. I think the division of resources, as I mentioned in the first part of the stack, that's where you can really get a benefit there. So if your database server is just being a database and your web server is just being a web server, you know, that's the start of that concept, because they're really two very different types of computation and the resources should be allocated accordingly. You know, my dream Magento stack would be probably running about 9 separate, you know, front-end servers and about 10 different back-end servers, all load balanced and divided up into according resources. But you know, obviously, not everybody wants to spend $11 million a month on their hosting. So yeah.
I'm assuming this has a combinatorial effect, I guess, of how much content you're trying to serve, but also how many users or concurrent users you're trying to serve that content to as well, and that's what would really dictate the technology that you're running.
That's exactly right. Yeah, how many concurrent sessions you expect to use, and that session layer goes all the way down to a database query. You know, how many database queries per second you're doing, how many web requests you're getting. You know, all the way back to the front sort of thing.
We know that there are plenty of businesses out there still managing their own server arrays, but that's obviously limiting when you compare with the cloud-based hosting solutions. For retailers, you'd expect, as you mentioned earlier, for promotional periods, those scalable hosting solutions are going to be the best option, I would have thought.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, most cloud systems provide some form of load balancing for those scalable operations. You know, with a lot of cloud providers, you can just stick a load balancer in and then stick more web servers behind it. You know, having a tuned web server can, you know, obviously help you there, but being able to allocate those CPU and RAM resources on the fly is also really important. So a lot of people sort of just say build another server, but you know, it is also good without having to actually physically change hardware to be able to say, oh, I'm going to double the RAM on that database server for, you know, between January 24 and you know, January 21 or something like that. So it's, yeah, I think those are the most important things to look for there.
Fantastic. Russell's come back to say thank you very much for the answer.
No problem.
There is a question from, we've still got a few minutes left, so people should feel free to keep throwing questions at us. I'll just work through them as we go. Owen had a question about Varnish. It's notoriously, at least my understanding, it has some tricks to actually installing it. Do you have any rough guidelines or pointers for the people out there, Mike?
Yeah, the trick with Varnish is it's effectively replacing your front-end web server as the things that a browser hits. So, you know, by default, a web server lives on port 80 of the server. So the first thing you need to do is install Varnish and get it to listen on port 80, and then switch your web server to listen on something else. Then you need to tell Varnish to point to that web server on, suppose we set the web server up on port 8080, then tell Varnish where the web server port is, and configure what they call a Varnish configuration language file. So that's a VCL. There are some really good default ones out there for Magento, which will get you up and running straight away. And there's a couple of really nice third-party extensions which talk to the Varnish cache for Magento. So if you're in a community build, I'd have a look at the NexusNet Turpentine extension, which you can get. It's freely available from the Magento Connect store. They've just recently put out a really nice update for that as well, with for Magento Community 1.8.1. So those are probably the quickest ways to get going. Yeah, if you've got a dev box or a virtual machine, you can have a bit of a play with it on. It's worth having a go at yourself, and you can use just a simple tool like Siege to you know, do a static page benchmark, and you know, that makes up part of our benchmarking tools. There are much more elaborate ones, but it's really easy to just say to Siege, look, throw 50 users at my server and tell me how many transactions per second I get. And so after you've installed Varnish and tweak your configuration, you can just rerun that again and again and see where your performance is increasing. If Owen wants to get in touch with me afterwards or anything, I can point him to some really good resources on how to configure Varnish for Magento.
Just before we do go on, Mike, on that note, I believe that you were happy to share your contact details. Is there an email address that our audience can get in touch with you on?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm Mike Lynch, so it's MLYNCH at macquarietelecom.com, and feel free to shoot emails through this afternoon.
Fantastic. I'm sure there'll be a few more questions that people might not have been brave enough to ask in the session, but there's been another one in the meantime from Samantha, and it sounds like Samantha is having some multi-channel concerns, so interfacing between POS systems, point of sale systems in retail, such as Retail Express, back into the back end of Magento. Sharing that data back and forth can obviously be an issue, especially when you're tacking on systems like CRMs and whatnot. Have you approached these situations before? Are there any recommendations for Samantha to make sure she's really got all those systems operating nicely?
Yeah, no worries. I think Magento has built-in web services, which is most likely what you're using to talk to those ERP systems, Samantha. So the web services are really good, but I have found that version 2 of the web services are very, very slow, and particularly on community build. I found it's actually better if you spend a little bit of time with your developers, it's better to write some extensions that talk to the core of Magento and provide an external web service. So you can do that via a JSON API or an XML API rather than the built-in Magento web service, and you'll probably get a much better performance increase there for that database writing and for accessing the code of Magento. You get, for each query, you get a huge delay just waiting for the Magento web service to be ready. So I'd really try to get your developers to, if they can, build a custom module for accessing the Magento core directly.
Fantastic. And we've just had another question come through from Kim. Kim's got I guess, a similar but very different situation where she's looking to, or her business is looking to launch two regional websites. One's a .com website and one's a UK version of the same website via a shared database. Obviously, they need to send localized content to each website. Is there a specific hosting solution or setup scenario that you would be suggesting to tackle that?
No worries. It's tricky. There's always two different ways to go with the sort of international multi-channel thing. So I would say by default, Magento's got a multi-site interface where you can create multiple sites and multiple views. So you can create a UK view with UK language and an Australian view with Australian language files. That can all come out of one Magento installation instance, which is probably the easiest and best way to do it. And then you can set up CMS pages, say your homepage with a certain slide banner, and allocate that just to your UK site or your UK view. That being said, some people are finding, and obviously that would share the whole same database. Some people are finding as content grows in the UK but doesn't grow in Australia or vice versa, they actually do a multi-instance installation. So Magento UK is a different build to the Magento Australia, and then do some form of database sharing, either by custom extensions or by in the back end of the server systems and data centers. So you can set up an rsync script or something like that to copy certain tables from the Australian site to the UK site. It can get a little tricky doing that though, so I'd definitely recommend going down the Magento multi-site installation if you can, because that's all available through the back end of the site and much more controllable by people who are uploading content to just one place.
Fantastic, Mike. Well, look, I think we have another question just to finish up, and this one kind of crosses the line between pure information and something that might be better to be followed up in a sales conversation. So we won't take it too far, but I and Wes are a little bit more interested in how you view the best way for businesses, particularly retailers, to work with their hosting solutions and service providers like Macquarie Telecom. Is it a necessity, for example, for the business to have their own in-house Magento expertise, such as yourself, Mike, or are you available to be consulting as part of ongoing fees that they would be paying to Macquarie Telecom? How does it work there?
Yeah, no worries. Definitely part of my role is consulting with the customers. So, I help out with solution architecture. I make recommendations on configurations and optimization, but we also have a partner network of Magento developers. So, we're not a development house, but we can recommend various partners. If you have someone you already know, or if we recommend somebody in your price point. But also we can work directly with your developers. So if you already have a development agency or in-house developers, I can work with them and provide them with instruction sets and optimization recommendations to get that stuff rolled out onto your site. So that's definitely part of my role. So Wes, get in touch and we can have a chat offline about how I would help with you guys moving forward. And it almost always starts with the benchmarking piece. So I'd almost always want to sort of throw what I could at your server and just give it a light test if it's live, and if you've got a development server, I'd like to give it a really heavy test to see how it's all configured and make some recommendations for you from there.
And your email address again, Mike, that was mlynch@macquarietelecom.com.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we'll send out all my contact details with any further requests as well.
Fantastic. And just to finish up, everyone, we are a little bit ahead of time, but that seems to have concluded the line of questioning. We have recorded this webinar, and that will be made available for Macquarie Telecom to share with you all. So look forward to that in the coming days, possibly next week. If there are any further questions, feel free to contact Mike directly. If it's anything about our webinar services, feel free to contact me at campbell@mediapad.com.au. Thank you all. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Stuart.
No problems. Thanks very much, Campbell.
Thanks, everyone.